The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Marcus, once a man they could dismiss, had just revealed his identity in the most shocking way possible. His title wasn't just a matter of authority, it was a symbol of everything he had endured to get to this moment. And while the officers struggled to regain their composure, Marcus knew this was more than just a confrontation, it was a turning point. But the drama wasn't over yet. In that brief, tense moment, Marcus realized that the encounter would ripple far beyond this single interaction. What had begun as a simple traffic stop was now a powerful lesson in identity, authority, and respect, a lesson the officers would not soon forget. Marcus drove home that morning with a sense of quiet contentment, unaware that this seemingly ordinary day would soon spiral into something far more significant. The sun was just beginning to climb in the sky, casting a warm glow on the city streets. He had spent the last several years earning his position as the state police chief, and though he felt a deep sense of pride in that achievement, it wasn't something he flaunted. "Marcus, just heading home," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though there was a quiet tension in the air. He wasn't going to engage in their petty games. He wasn't going to allow them to bait him into an argument. He had been in their shoes once, after all. He had once been the young officer, eager and unsure, but he had learned the hard way that arrogance and disrespect only made things worse. The younger officer glanced at the older officer, a smug smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Must be nice to be in a hurry, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself. "What's a guy like you doing out here anyway?" The comment stung. Marcus had heard it all before, these insinuations that someone like him didn't belong in certain areas, that he wasn't worthy of respect. It was as if they were trying to define him before he could even speak. The officer's words were loaded with assumptions, stereotypes that Marcus had spent years fighting against. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to shrink in the face of their ignorance. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. The moment stretched out in the air between them, heavy with the tension of unspoken truths. He had spent his life in a world where he was constantly forced to prove himself, whether to his peers, to his superiors, or to the very people who had underestimated him from the start. This was no different. "You know who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. He looked at both officers, watching their expressions shift from casual disinterest to cautious curiosity. He could tell they weren't sure where he was going with this. The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Should I?" he asked, clearly uninterested in the answer. But Marcus knew this was the moment. He could feel the weight of it. This was the moment he could reclaim his dignity, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. "I'm the new state police chief," Marcus said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm your boss." The shock on the officers' faces was immediate. The younger officer blinked, his mouth slightly agape, as though he hadn't quite processed what Marcus had said. The older officer, who had been more composed up until this point, looked at Marcus with confusion. It was as if they both couldn't fathom that the man they had just mocked could possibly be someone of such importance. They stared at him in stunned silence, the realization dawning on them slowly. The younger officer was the first to break the silence. "Wait, what?" he stammered. You're the chief." His voice wavered with disbelief. Marcus nodded, not bothering to smile. "Yes. I'm the state police chief. And this moment right here? It's a reminder that you don't get to treat people like that." The officers stood there, their bravado deflating like a balloon. They had no idea what to say, no way to undo the damage they had done. The shift in their demeanor was palpable, they had gone from condescension to uncomfortable respect in a matter of seconds. But for Marcus, this was just another lesson. It wasn't just about the officers, it was about the system, the culture that allowed such disrespect to exist in the first place. The silence stretched between them like an uncomfortable fog, thick with the weight of the revelation. Marcus could feel the tension in the air as the officers stood frozen, their once confident posture now reduced to an awkward uncertainty. The older officer, his face flushed with embarrassment, was the first to recover, clearing his throat as he fumbled for words. "Well, Chief, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice betraying the confusion that had gripped him in the wake of Marcus's announcement. Marcus remained composed, but inside, the satisfaction of seeing their arrogance crumble was mixed with a deep sense of disappointment. He had hoped this moment would be one of clarity, not just for these officers, but for the system that had failed to teach them the fundamental principles of respect and professionalism. He wasn't angry, not in the way many would expect. Instead, there was a quiet resolve inside him, a burning determination to ensure that no other officer, no other citizen, would ever feel the sting of this kind of treatment again. The younger officer shifted on his feet, his eyes darting from Marcus to his partner, unsure of what to do or say next. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his tone flat and unconvincing. "We just didn't know, sir." And Marcus knew this wouldn't be the end of it. This incident would ripple through the department, the shockwaves of the encounter making their way through every corner of the force. The officers would carry the memory of their humiliation with them for a long time, but for Marcus, the real work was just beginning. With a final nod, Marcus slowly started his car again, the officers standing back as he shifted into gear. He could see the younger officer watching him, his eyes now full of something different, respect, perhaps, or maybe something more complex, something that came from the realization that things needed to change. As Marcus drove away, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he had to confront ignorance or prejudice, but he also knew that today had been a turning point. He was no longer just part of the system, he was changing it, one moment at a time. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let moments lick. Marcus spent the next few days reflecting on what had happened during that traffic stop. He knew he couldn't just move on from it. It wasn't just an embarrassing incident for those officers, it was a wake-up call for the entire system. The exchange had shaken him, not because of what they said, but because of what they represented. It wasn't just these two officers that needed to change, it was the culture they embodied, a culture that still held deep-seated prejudices and assumptions about who belonged in positions of power, and who didn't. As the new state police chief, Marcus knew that he had a unique opportunity to address these issues head-on. He wasn't interested in simply holding the officers accountable, he wanted to make systemic changes that would ensure incidents like this didn't happen again. It wasn't enough to teach respect on an individual level, he needed to overhaul the way the entire department viewed its relationship with the communities it served. In the days following the incident, Marcus called for a series of meetings with his senior staff. He wanted to address the issue of racial bias, both implicit and explicit, within the department. He made it clear that this wasn't just about the officers who had humiliated him on the side of the road, it was about every officer, every sergeant, every lieutenant who had ever treated a member of the public with disrespect based on their race, their gender, or their background. The conversation needed to be uncomfortable. It needed to challenge long-held beliefs and force people to confront the reality of the biases they carried with them. As Marcus stood before his team, his words were direct but measured. "This department is built on a foundation of trust," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "When that trust is broken, when people are treated unfairly, it undermines the very essence of what we do. We are here to serve and protect. Not to judge. Not to make assumptions. Not to treat people as less than human because of how they look or where they come from." The room was silent as Marcus spoke, each officer taking in the weight of his message. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Some would resist. Some would feel threatened by the idea of change. But he wasn't there to make friends, he was there to ensure that this department lived up to its highest ideals. He would rather face resistance now than let another officer humiliate an innocent person on the road again. He began a new initiative, one that would include ongoing training on racial profiling, implicit bias, and community engagement. It would involve bringing in experts to speak on these issues, people who could help officers understand the deep-rooted nature of bias and how it manifested in their work. He also set up anonymous reporting systems for officers to safely report any incidents of racism or mistreatment within the department. He wasn't naive, he knew that change would take time, but he was determined to make progress. This pass without making them count. As Marcus sat in his office late that night, he thought about how far he had come. From the young officer trying to prove himself, to the man now sitting at the helm of the entire state police force, he had lived through countless experiences that had shaped his views on justice and fairness. He knew that no one was born with the ability to be a perfect leader. It took time. It took humility. But most importantly, it took the willingness to confront difficult truths about yourself and your environment. Yet, even as he worked tirelessly on these reforms, Marcus knew that his efforts were not going to be enough on their own. He needed the support of his officers, the backing of the community, and the belief of the people who depended on law enforcement to uphold the law fairly. And that was where the real challenge lay. If his officers weren't committed to changing, if they didn't understand the gravity of their actions, no amount of training or policy changes would make a difference. The very next day, he took the unprecedented step of speaking publicly about the incident. It was a risk. He knew that airing this kind of dirty laundry could open him up to criticism, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. He wanted to show the public that their police force was accountable, that it wasn't just the officers who had to answer for their mistakes, but the entire department. He spoke candidly about the traffic stop, the officers' behavior, and the reforms he was pushing to ensure that this kind of mistreatment would never happen again. He emphasized that leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about acknowledging your flaws, learning from them, and striving to do better. The response from the public was mixed. Some applauded him for his honesty, for taking a stand against racism within his own ranks. Others were skeptical, questioning whether these efforts would truly lead to change. But Marcus wasn't focused on the critics. He wasn't going to stop because a few people doubted him. His mission was clear. He had to change the culture from within, and if he had to face resistance every step of the way, then so be it. As weeks turned into months, Marcus's efforts began to show results. More officers came forward to report incidents of racism they had witnessed or been a part of. The anonymous reporting system, which had initially been met with skepticism, was being used more frequently. Officers who had once been indifferent to issues of racial bias were now engaging in conversations, attending trainings, and reflecting on their own actions. Slowly but surely, the department was evolving. But the real test came when Marcus received an invitation to speak at a community meeting in a part of the state that had long been at odds with the police force. The neighborhood had been plagued with stories of police brutality, racial profiling, and a deep mistrust of the system. It was a community that had been treated as an afterthought, and its residents had long since given up on seeing meaningful change. Marcus knew that this would be his toughest challenge yet. He arrived at the community center with a sense of both hope and apprehension. The room was packed with residents, many of whom were openly skeptical of law enforcement. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus could feel the weight of the eyes that scrutinized his every move. He had been in similar rooms before, but this was different. This wasn't a room full of officers who had to be convinced, this was a room full of people who had been failed by the very system he represented. He stood at the front, and for a long moment, he simply listened. He listened as people spoke about their experiences, about the times they had been pulled over for no reason, about the times they had been treated with disdain by officers who didn't care to understand their struggles. He listened to their pain, their frustration, and their anger. And when it was his turn to speak, he did so without pretense. "I know that many of you don't trust me," he began. "And I understand why. But I want you to know that I'm here because I believe things can change. I believe we can build a police force that serves and protects everyone equally. I'm not here to make excuses for the past, but I am here to be part of a solution. We can't change history, but we can change the future." And that starts with me, with all of us, right here, right now. The room was quiet, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't immediate, but it was there. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward reconciliation. Marcus knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like real progress was possible. In the months that followed, Marcus continued to build trust with the community. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms he had put in place were having a tangible impact. He knew that the changes he was making wouldn't solve everything overnight, but he was determined to see it through. And as he looked back at that fateful traffic stop, he realized that it had been the catalyst for something far greater than just a personal confrontation. It had been the beginning of a transformation, not just for him, but for the entire state police force, and for the community they swore to protect. Months passed, and though the department was evolving, the work was far from over. Marcus knew that even small victories needed to be celebrated because each one was a sign that the larger changes he envisioned were beginning to take root. He had set his sights on a long-term vision, one that would require years of work to fully implement, but he was prepared for the journey. His dedication had already started reshaping the public's perception of the police, slowly turning skepticism into cautious hope. Yet, despite the progress, there were still moments of resistance. Some officers continued to see him as an outsider, someone who had risen too fast, too far, in a system built on tradition. In a department as large as theirs, change wasn't easy. Many of the older officers had been in the force for decades, and their attitudes had been shaped by years of entrenched practices that didn't easily bend to new perspectives. These were officers who had seen their own fair share of systemic issues, but they didn't always recognize them or, worse, didn't believe they were a problem. The more Marcus tried to push for reform, the more he encountered whispers in the halls, grumbling from those who felt threatened by his vision of an inclusive, more just department. Some colleagues, who had once supported him, began distancing themselves, unable to reconcile their old ways with the progressive changes Marcus was advocating for. One afternoon, Marcus received a call that would force him to confront the reality of how deeply ingrained the biases were. A viral video had surfaced of a police officer on duty, engaged in an altercation with a group of young black men during a routine stop. The video, captured by a bystander, showed the officer using unnecessary force, shouting racial slurs, and acting with a degree of hostility that went far beyond what was acceptable. The video had made its way across social media, and the department's reputation was at risk. Marcus had no choice but to act swiftly. He called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team and informed them that the officer involved had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The atmosphere in the room was tense as Marcus outlined the steps the department would take to handle the situation. The incident could not be ignored. It was another painful reminder that despite the changes being implemented, there was still so much work to do. He couldn't just hold the officer accountable. He had to make sure the entire department understood that this type of behavior, from any officer, would not be tolerated. In the days that followed, Marcus personally visited the community where the altercation had taken place. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was about showing that he, as the chief, was willing to walk into uncomfortable situations to earn back the trust of the people he served. The community members were skeptical at first, their anger and hurt palpable. They had seen this happen before, officers behaving poorly, the department making empty promises, only to see things stay the same. But Marcus didn't offer platitudes. He didn't make grand promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he listened. He allowed the people to speak, to vent their frustrations, and to express their hopes for the future. "I know this isn't easy," Marcus said as he addressed the crowd, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "But I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you that we are committed to making real changes. We are going to address this incident, and we are going to make sure nothing like this happens again. But this will only work if we work together. I'm here to listen, and I'm here to act. If you want to see things change, I need your help. We can't do this without you." For the first time in a long while, Marcus saw a shift in the room. It wasn't a complete transformation, but the anger had subsided enough for dialogue to begin. That was a victory in itself. In the following weeks, the investigation into the officer's actions was thorough, and it was clear that the officer had not followed protocol or demonstrated the level of respect expected from law enforcement. The officer was dismissed from the force, but Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't just about firing one officer, it was about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to flourish. That moment underscored a critical lesson for Marcus. While reforming the department's culture was important, reforming the community's relationship with the police was just as vital. He had spent months working from the inside to change the department, but the work wasn't complete until the community saw and felt the difference. He wasn't naive enough to think that a few public apologies and policy changes would heal years of mistrust. But he believed that by continuing to show up, by continuing to have difficult conversations, the community could begin to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The months turned into a year, and Marcus found himself constantly torn between the grind of overseeing the department's daily operations and his broader vision for reform. He kept pushing forward, knowing that each step forward would be met with resistance, but he also knew that each victory would inspire more change. Slowly, officers began to adopt new approaches when engaging with the public, employing de-escalation tactics that were more effective and less confrontational. Marcus had ensured that community outreach programs were implemented at every level, and the department's leadership had begun to reflect the diversity of the state it served. But the challenges didn't stop. One evening, while Marcus was attending a meeting at a local church, a local journalist approached him. The journalist had been covering the department for years and had seen the transformation Marcus had instigated. But there was still one lingering question that she was desperate to know: do you think the changes you've implemented can truly last? Marcus paused before answering. The question hung in the air like an unspoken truth, one that he hadn't fully considered until now. He had been so focused on driving change that he hadn't allowed himself to consider whether this progress could be sustained in the long run. He had put systems in place, but systems alone didn't guarantee success. What would ensure lasting change was a commitment from every officer, every community member, and every leader involved. The momentum had to continue. Nothing lasts unless we continue to fight for it, Marcus replied. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires constant vigilance, constant reflection, and the willingness to make hard decisions. I've made mistakes. We all have. But as long as we remained committed to growth, to listening, and to acting with integrity, I believe we can create a force that people can trust. And I'll keep fighting for that, every single day. The journalist nodded and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He knew that the future wasn't guaranteed, and that the road ahead would continue to be filled with challenges. But he had come a long way, and he was no longer the same man who had been humiliated on the side of the road all those months ago. He had faced adversity, yes, but he had also learned from it. And now, he was in a position to ensure that others wouldn't have to face the same struggles. He had become more than just a leader of a department, he had become a symbol of change. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew that the real work had only just begun. In the end, Marcus realized that true leadership was never about being in charge, it was about inspiring others to be better, to do better. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to do just that. A year had passed since the incident that had sparked Marcus's transformation from an officer humiliated on the side of the road to a leader who had set in motion a sweeping reform across the state's police force. The road hadn't been easy, and the weight of responsibility had only grown heavier with each passing day. But now, as he sat at his desk late one evening, looking over the latest reports on his department's community outreach programs and the progress of implicit bias training, he couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The department had made significant strides in fostering a more transparent and accountable culture. But that wasn't enough. He understood that lasting change was not something that could be measured in statistics alone, it was about how people felt when they interacted with his officers. It was about rebuilding a bond of trust that had been broken long ago. His mind returned to the community meeting he had attended months ago, in the neighborhood that had been so deeply impacted by years of police mistreatment. When he had first stepped into that room, the anger and distrust were so palpable it almost felt like the walls were closing in on him. But as the months passed, he saw real changes in how the community interacted with the police. Crime rates had dropped, not through force, but through proactive community engagement. More residents were coming forward with tips, knowing they would be listened to. He had made sure that officers weren't just seen as enforcers of the law, but as partners in maintaining a sense of peace and security. But Marcus also knew that these successes came with a price. The department had lost officers who couldn't accept the new direction he was pushing. Some had left on their own, unable or unwilling to adjust to the new policies and the expectations for better conduct. Others had been let go, their actions too egregious to ignore. There were whispers in the department about Marcus's leadership, about the direction he was taking, and many doubted whether his reforms would truly last. It wasn't just a question of changing the department's practices, it was a question of changing hearts and minds. And that wasn't something that could be done with training alone. The shift needed to be internal, personal. Marcus had always been one to lead by example, but he was beginning to realize that even his own example wasn't enough. He needed to confront the deep-rooted culture within the department, the subtle biases and systemic problems that went unaddressed for too long. He needed to continue to model empathy, humility, and resilience, not just for the public, but for the officers themselves. And so, he began organizing even more intensive internal discussions, bringing in a range of perspectives. He asked officers to share their own experiences, their struggles, and their doubts. He wanted them to see that he wasn't perfect, that he, too, was on a journey of learning and growth. By opening up those difficult conversations, he created an environment where vulnerability was not a weakness, but a necessary part of transformation. The work was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. Some days Marcus felt the weight of the task more than others, especially when he received reports of isolated incidents where officers fell back into old patterns. There were still instances where racial profiling crept into stops, where excessive force was used in situations that could have been de-escalated. Every time one of those incidents occurred, it felt like a setback, like a punch to the gut. The anger and disappointment he felt in those moments were hard to shake, but he also knew that giving in to frustration would only set the department back even further. Instead, he approached every setback as a learning opportunity. The process of healing was not linear, it was full of setbacks, relapses, and hard-earned victories. Marcus knew that if he didn't keep pushing forward, even in the darkest moments, the department would never fully change. One of the toughest moments came when Marcus was forced to make another difficult decision, one that would test his resolve and his leadership in a way he had not yet faced. A high-profile case of police brutality had surfaced in another county. The video, which had gone viral, showed an officer violently arresting a teenager who had been accused of a minor offense. The incident was incredibly distressing, not only because of the brutality shown, but because it came on the heels of the reforms Marcus had fought so hard to implement. The officer in question was from the same department Marcus led, though they weren't directly under his command. Marcus felt the weight of the situation immediately. He called an emergency meeting with his team and addressed them with the gravity the situation demanded. "This is not who we are," he said. "This is not the department we are building. We will take immediate action, and we will show the world that we will not tolerate this behavior. We are better than this." As news of the incident spread, Marcus found himself fielding calls from the governor, media outlets, and concerned citizens. The pressure was immense. Some people wondered if his reforms were really working. Others questioned whether he had the authority to control every officer in the state. Marcus knew this would be a test not only of his leadership but of the department's commitment to the principles he had instilled. He made the decision to fast-track an independent investigation into the incident. The officer responsible was placed on administrative leave, and Marcus announced a series of changes to ensure this type of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. It was an immediate, decisive response, but Marcus knew it wasn't enough. They had to go deeper. The department had to answer for its failures, and they had to rebuild trust all over again. The case went to trial, and Marcus followed the proceedings closely, knowing that the outcome would be watched not just by his officers, but by the entire community. It wasn't just about justice for the victim, it was about sending a message that such behavior would not be tolerated, no matter who the perpetrator was. When the verdict came in, the officer was convicted. The relief Marcus felt was tempered by the knowledge that it was only a small step in the larger journey of reform. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and unfortunately, it probably wouldn't be the last. But each incident like this was an opportunity to reassess, to reset, and to reassert the department's commitment to justice. As Marcus reflected on all the challenges he had faced in the past few years, he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly making a difference. Had the reforms he initiated been enough? Had he done enough to change the culture from the inside? He knew that change was never quick, and he wasn't deluded into thinking everything would be solved in a few years. But he had seen enough to believe in the possibility of lasting transformation. He had witnessed officers stepping up, taking accountability for their actions, and owning their mistakes. He had seen the community begin to trust the police once more. Slowly, cautiously, the bond between the department and the people it served was being repaired. The road ahead was long. The work was never done. But Marcus was no longer the same man he had been when he first took the job. The time he had spent battling through setbacks and fighting for systemic change had shaped him into a leader who understood that leadership was about resilience, humility, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about continuously striving to be better, for himself, for his department, and for the people who needed the police to be a force for good. Marcus knew that this wasn't just about leading a police department, it was about changing the very heart of law enforcement, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. And so, as he sat at his desk, looking out over the city, he knew that there would be more challenges, more difficult decisions, and more moments where he would feel like giving up. But the commitment he had made to this mission, to the people of his state, was unshakable. He would continue the fight, because the changes he had started, the momentum he had built, were too important to turn back now.